Crimson flames devoured silk curtains as agonized screams pierced the humid Louisiana night. By dawn on October 15, 1852, the Magnolia Ridge Plantation mansion would be nothing but charred timber and ash, its grand ballroom floor littered with the bones of New Orleans' most elite families. This is the story of how one woman's thirst for vengeance consumed an entire harvest celebration on the night when cotton fortunes were meant to be celebrated. The bitter autumn wind carried the scent of burning cedar and human flesh across the sugarcane fields, while inside the blazing manor crystal chandeliers crashed onto marble floors where moments before plantation owners had waltzed in imported silks. But in the servants' quarters behind the house, where enslaved families had watched through cracked windows, 22-year-old Rovira Thalrose had finally decided that some injustices demanded to be answered with fire. What drove a kitchen servant to transform a night of revelry into a funeral pyre that would haunt Louisiana's collective memory for generations? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The grandfather clock in the Belafonte Mansion's grand foyer had just struck 11 when the first scream shattered the harvest ball's elegant atmosphere. Silk ball gowns caught fire like kindling as panicked guests trampled one another in their desperate flight from flames that seemed to hunger for human flesh. The crystal chandelier, imported from France at enormous expense, crashed down onto the mahogany dance floor, where moments before, Louisiana's wealthiest plantation owners had celebrated their cotton fortunes with champagne and waltzes. Through the mansion's towering windows, the glow of fire cast dancing shadows across sugarcane fields that stretched toward the Mississippi River. The autumn harvest moon, full and bright, bore witness to a conflagration that would reduce one of Louisiana's grandest estates to nothing more than smoking ruins and scattered bones. By morning, the Belafonte Plantation house would exist only in memory and legend, its destruction marking the end of a family dynasty built on human suffering. But this inferno was no accident. In the servants' quarters behind the burning mansion, empty spaces told the story of careful planning. Missing lamp oil, vanished cooking alcohol, and absent cleaning supplies painted a picture of deliberate preparation. Someone with intimate knowledge of the house's layout had transformed a celebration into a crematorium, turning the tools of domestic service into instruments of deadly justice. The flames consumed everything with democratic hunger: silk curtains worth more than most people's yearly wages, mahogany furniture that had taken master craftsmen months to create, Persian rugs that represented fortunes beyond imagination. The heat grew so intense that the mansion's brick foundation began to crack, while the lead glass windows exploded outward like shotgun blasts, sending shards glittering across the well-manicured lawns. As the fire roared through the structure, it devoured more than just material wealth. Account books that documented the buying and selling of human beings turned to ash. Correspondence between plantation owners discussing breeding programs and punishment methods disappeared into smoke. Legal documents that treated people as property crumbled into nothingness. The flames erased not just a building, but the written evidence of systematic cruelty that had funded Louisiana's sugar and cotton empires. Among the fleeing guests, those who survived would carry memories of a night when the natural order of their world collapsed in spectacular fashion. They had entered the Belafonte mansion as masters of the universe, controlling the lives and deaths of hundreds of human beings with the casual authority of gods. They fled as mortals, their expensive clothing singed, their carefully arranged hair disheveled, their absolute power revealed as an illusion that fire could destroy as easily as silk. The sound of collapsing timber echoed across the plantation grounds as support beams, weakened by intense heat, gave way under the mansion's massive weight. Room after room succumbed to the advancing flames, each space telling its own story of luxury, built on the backs of human bondage. The library, where Malvin Carraith had kept his collection of books on agricultural science and human management, became a furnace of burning paper and leather. The dining room, where elaborate meals had been served by hands that would never taste such food, transformed into a cauldron of melting silver and exploding wine bottles. The mansion's second floor, where the Belafonte family had slept in beds made with cotton picked by enslaved fingers, became a trap of smoke and flame. The children's nursery, with its expensive toys and imported furniture, burned alongside the master bedroom where decisions about buying and selling human beings had been made between silk sheets. Justice, it seemed, made no distinction between the innocent and the guilty when they lived in houses built on the suffering of others. In the distance, church bells began to toll as news of the disaster spread through the surrounding parish. Fire brigades from neighboring plantations rushed toward the orange glow that painted the night sky. But their efforts would prove futile. The blaze had gained too much momentum, consumed too much fuel, spread too far to be contained by bucket brigades and prayer. This was not a fire that wanted to be extinguished. It had work to finish. As the clock tower collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning debris, its hands frozen at 11:47, time itself seemed to stop at the Belafonte plantation. The harvest ball that was meant to celebrate another year of prosperity had become a funeral pyre for a way of life that had ruled Louisiana for generations. The question that would haunt investigators and historians alike was not whether the fire had been set deliberately, but who among the plantation's inhabitants had possessed both the knowledge and the courage to orchestrate such complete destruction. The answer lay hidden in the shadows of the sugarcane fields, where a figure moved through the darkness with the calm purpose of someone whose life's work was finally complete. Whether that figure was human or spirit, survivor or sacrifice, would become the subject of legends that would outlive everyone who witnessed the Belafonte mansion's spectacular end. The Mississippi Delta in 1852 stretched like a green empire across southern Louisiana, its fertile soil enriched by centuries of river floods and watered by the blood of countless souls who had died to make other men rich. Spanish moss hung from ancient oak trees like funeral shrouds, while the humid air carried the sweet scent of magnolia blossoms mixed with the harsher odors of human sweat and industrial sugar processing. This was a land where beauty and brutality existed in perfect, terrible harmony. The Belafonte plantation sprawled across 8,000 acres of prime Louisiana bottomland, its boundaries marked by the meandering curves of the Mississippi River to the east and the cypress swamps to the west. The property had been carved from wilderness by 3 generations of the Belafonte family, each adding to the estate's size and grandeur through the systematic exploitation of human labor. What had begun as a modest sugar farm in the 1790s had evolved into one of Louisiana's most profitable and prestigious agricultural operations. At the heart of this empire stood the mansion itself, a testament to Greek Revival architecture and Southern ambition. 3 stories of white-painted brick rose from manicured gardens, supported by towering columns that created deep, cooling shadows across the wraparound verandas. The house contained 42 rooms, each designed to showcase the family's wealth and refinement. Crystal chandeliers imported from Europe, illuminated ceilings painted by artists brought from New Orleans at enormous expense. Mahogany furniture, crafted by master woodworkers using timber from the plantation's own forests, filled parlors and bedrooms with the warm glow of polished wood. The mansion's interior told the story of a family that had transformed agricultural profits into cultural sophistication. The library housed over 3,000 volumes, including first editions of European classics and the latest scientific treatises on agricultural management. The music room contained a pianoforte shipped from Vienna, while the dining room's massive table could seat 30 guests beneath a chandelier that had once graced a French chateau. Persian rugs covered floors of imported marble, while oil paintings depicting European landscapes adorned walls that had never known want or uncertainty. But this luxury existed in stark contrast to the reality of life in the plantation's quarters, where 412 enslaved human beings lived in conditions that reduced them to agricultural machinery with beating hearts. The quarters consisted of long rows of wooden cabins, each measuring 16 feet by 20 feet, and housing entire families in spaces smaller than the mansion's pantries. These buildings lacked proper foundations, adequate heating, or weather-tight construction. In winter, occupants stuffed rags and moss into gaps between boards to keep out the cold, while summer brought stifling heat that made sleep almost impossible. The daily routine of plantation life began before dawn, when the overseer's bell summoned workers to another day of backbreaking labor in the sugarcane fields. Men, women, and older teenagers worked from sunrise to sunset during harvest season, cutting cane under the brutal Louisiana sun, while overseers on horseback watched for any sign of slowing or resistance. The work was dangerous. Cane knives could sever fingers or hands with one careless motion, while the industrial machinery that processed raw cane into sugar had claimed limbs and lives with mechanical indifference. Master Malvin Carraith ruled this empire with the absolute authority of a medieval lord, though he preferred to think of himself as a benevolent patriarch guiding his human property toward productive lives. At 62, Carraith had inherited the plantation from his father and expanded it through careful investment and ruthless labor management. He kept meticulous records of his enslaved population, tracking births, deaths, injuries, and productivity, with the same attention he gave to livestock and equipment. In his mind, efficient human resource management was simply good business practice. His wife, Rovira Thalrose Carraith, presided over the mansion's domestic operations with the refined grace expected of Louisiana plantation society. She managed a household staff of 23 enslaved people who maintained the family's comfortable lifestyle, from the cooks who prepared elaborate meals, to the seamstresses who created the family's clothing, to the personal servants who attended to their most intimate needs. Rovira saw herself as a cultured woman who brought civilization to the wilderness, though she never questioned the system that made her refinement possible. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Carraiths' 3 grown offspring had inherited their parents' attitudes toward human bondage as naturally as they had inherited the family's green eyes and auburn hair. Vorich Tenvale Carraith, the eldest son at 34, managed the plantation's day-to-day operations with mechanical efficiency. His younger brother, Sylvan Maurice Carraith, oversaw the sugar mill and shipping operations that transported their products to New Orleans markets. Their sister, Kalis Norwick Carraith Patterson, had married into another prominent planting family, but returned frequently to the family estate, bringing her own perspectives on managing human property. The Belafonte plantation operated as a self-contained world, complete with its own blacksmith shop, carpenter's workshop, medical facilities, and even a small chapel where enslaved people were required to attend Sunday services that preached obedience as a Christian virtue. The plantation produced nearly everything its inhabitants needed to survive: food, clothing, tools, and furniture, using the labor of people who would never own anything they created with their own hands. This economic system had made the Carraith family enormously wealthy. Their annual income exceeded $50,000, a fortune that placed them among Louisiana's planting elite. They owned property in New Orleans, maintained accounts with banks in both New York and London, and moved in social circles that included governors, senators, and foreign dignitaries. Their success had been built on the systematic exploitation of human labor, but they saw themselves as pillars of civilization, bringing order and prosperity to the Louisiana frontier. The harvest ball that would become the setting for the mansion's destruction represented the pinnacle of plantation society's self-celebration. Each autumn, the Carraith family hosted neighboring plantation owners and their families for an evening of dining, dancing, and congratulations on another profitable year. The guest list included the most powerful names in Louisiana agriculture, men who collectively owned thousands of human beings and controlled vast fortunes built on sugar, cotton, and rice cultivation. These gatherings served multiple purposes beyond mere entertainment. They provided opportunities for business negotiations, marriage arrangements between prominent families, and political discussions that would influence state and national policies. The Harvest Ball was where Louisiana's planting elite reinforced their social bonds and collective identity as masters of an agricultural empire that stretched across the Gulf South. As October 15, 1852 approached, the Belafonte mansion buzzed with preparation for that year's harvest celebration. The finest foods were ordered from New Orleans, while musicians were engaged to provide entertainment for dancing that would continue until dawn. Crystal and silver were polished to mirror brightness, while flower arrangements were designed to showcase the plantation's gardens. Everything was planned to demonstrate the Carraith family's position at the apex of Southern society. But in the quarters behind the mansion, a different kind of preparation was taking place, planned by someone who understood the difference between the glittering surface of plantation life and the human cost that made such luxury possible. 22-year-old Rovira Thalrose moved through the Belafonte mansion's kitchen with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to make herself nearly invisible. Her calloused hands, scarred by years of handling hot pots and sharp knives, betrayed the hard labor that had defined her existence since earliest memory, while her dark eyes held an intelligence that plantation society preferred not to acknowledge in those it classified as property. She had been born in the cabin behind the sugar mill, delivered by her mother's hands on a night when October storms lashed the Louisiana coast, and the master was away in New Orleans conducting business. Rovira's mother, Thesia Mornell, had worked in the Belafonte kitchens for over 30 years, rising from scullery help to head cook through a combination of culinary skill and careful diplomacy. Thesia understood the delicate balance required to survive in the liminal space between the mansion and the quarters, serving a family that relied on her expertise while never allowing her to forget her legal status as property. She had taught her daughter the same careful navigation, showing Rovira how to anticipate needs before they were spoken, how to move through rooms without drawing attention, how to hear everything while appearing to listen to nothing. The kitchen had become Rovira's domain by the time she reached 18, her natural talent for cooking elevated by years of watching her mother transform simple ingredients into elaborate meals that graced the Carruth family table. She knew the precise temperature needed to achieve the perfect caramelization on crème brûlée, understood how to balance spices in the complex Creole dishes that impressed visiting dignitaries, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to coordinate multiple courses for formal dinners that might seat 40 guests. Her skills had made her valuable to the Carruth family, but value and humanity remained distinctly separate concepts in their minds. Every morning, Rovira rose before dawn to begin preparations for the day's meals, her movements synchronized with the rhythms of a household that consumed her labor while denying her personhood. She knew the family's preferences with intimate precision. Master Malvin preferred his coffee strong and black, served in the china cup with the chip along the rim that he claimed brought him luck. Mistress Orellaith favored delicate pastries with her morning tea, served on the silver tray that had belonged to her grandmother. Young Master Vorik ate quickly and without comment, focused always on the business correspondence that accompanied his meals. The kitchen became Rovira's observatory of plantation life, a vantage point from which she witnessed the daily operations of a system that reduced human beings to agricultural assets. She watched as Master Malvin reviewed purchase orders for new enslaved people, discussing their acquisition with the same detachment he might show when buying livestock. She overheard conversations about breeding programs designed to increase the plantation's human inventory, strategies for maximizing labor efficiency, and punishments designed to maintain discipline among the quarters' population. Through her mother, Rovira learned the hidden histories of the Belafonte plantation, stories that would never appear in official records or family chronicles. She heard about Arendor Vellecrest, sold away to a Mississippi cotton plantation when Master Malvin needed cash for expansion. She learned of Lunara Feldren, who had died in the sugar mill when loose clothing caught in the machinery while overseers looked away. She discovered the fate of Elwayne Draylen, whipped to death for the crime of teaching other enslaved people to read using a Bible he had found in the mansion's library. These stories shaped Rovira's understanding of her world in ways that formal education never could. She learned that survival required not just physical endurance, but psychological armor strong enough to witness daily atrocities, while maintaining the facade of contentment that the Carruth family expected from their human property. She developed the ability to split her consciousness, keeping part of herself safely hidden, while the rest performed the role of the grateful, loyal servant that plantation society demanded. Rovira's intelligence manifested in ways that had to remain carefully concealed. She taught herself to read by studying discarded newspapers in the trash, practiced writing by scratching letters in the dirt behind the kitchen, and developed mathematical skills by mentally calculating the costs of the elaborate meals she prepared. She understood that knowledge was dangerous for someone in her position, but she couldn't suppress her hunger for learning any more than she could stop breathing. Her relationship with the Carruth family was complex, built on layers of genuine affection twisted by the fundamental power imbalance that defined every interaction. She had comforted young Master Sylvan when childhood nightmares woke him crying, had nursed Mistress Orlith through influenza that nearly claimed her life, and had celebrated quietly when the family's business ventures succeeded. Yet she also understood that these same people would sell her without hesitation if financial necessity or personal convenience demanded it. The contradictions of plantation life created psychological pressures that few enslaved people discussed openly, even among themselves. Rovira found herself caring for people who legally owned her, protecting those who could destroy her life with a single word, serving a family that saw her as both indispensable and completely disposable. The emotional labor required to navigate these relationships was as exhausting as the physical demands of her daily work, requiring constant vigilance and careful performance. As harvest season approached in 1852, Rovira noticed changes in the mansion's atmosphere that others might have missed. Master Malvin spent increasing amounts of time reviewing financial documents, his conversations with his sons growing more intense and urgent. Mistress Orlith's social correspondence increased, suggesting that the harvest ball would be larger and more elaborate than usual. The family's excitement about the approaching celebration contrasted sharply with the exhaustion visible in the quarters, where extended workdays had pushed people to their physical limits. Rovira's position in the kitchen provided her with unique insights into the family's private moments and unguarded conversations. She witnessed their casual discussions about the human beings they owned, heard their calculations about breeding schedules and sale prices, observed their complete indifference to the suffering that occurred just beyond their sight. These observations accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer of evidence that the people she served daily were fundamentally different from her in ways that had nothing to do with law or economics. The realization that had been building throughout her life crystallized during the weeks before the harvest ball. As she prepared increasingly elaborate meals for family meetings and social events, listening to conversations about maximizing profit from human labor, Rovira began to understand that her situation would never improve through patience, loyalty, or exceptional service. The system that held her in bondage was not a temporary condition to be endured, but a permanent structure designed to extract maximum value from her life while giving nothing in return. This understanding created a transformation in Rovira's consciousness that was invisible to those around her. Outwardly, she continued to perform her duties with the same efficiency and apparent contentment that had always characterized her work. She prepared meals, managed kitchen staff, and maintained the domestic operations that kept the Carraith household running smoothly. But internally, she had begun to see her situation with the clarity that comes from abandoning hope for gradual change. The kitchen that had been her domain became something different in Rovira's transformed perception. Instead of simply a workplace, it became an arsenal filled with tools that could serve purposes beyond cooking. Knives sharp enough to section meat could cut other things. Fires hot enough to render fat could consume other materials. Chemicals used for cleaning could serve different functions when properly concentrated and applied. The intimate knowledge of the mansion's layout that made her valuable as a servant could be applied to entirely different objectives. As the harvest ball approached and the mansion filled with preparations for celebration, Rovira began her own preparations for something entirely different. The transformation was complete. She had moved from accepting her circumstances to actively planning their change, from servant to architect of destruction. The autumn of 1852 brought changes to the Belafonte plantation that created an atmosphere of barely contained tension, like the pressure that builds before a violent storm breaks across the Louisiana landscape. The sugarcane harvest had proven exceptionally profitable, with market prices reaching levels that promised enormous returns for plantation owners throughout the region. Master Malvin's satisfaction with his financial success manifested in expansive plans for the future, and casual indifference to the human cost of his prosperity, a combination that pushed his enslaved population toward their breaking point. Rovira watched these developments from her position in the kitchen, observing how increased profits translated into harsher working conditions for those who generated the wealth they would never share. The successful harvest meant longer days in the cane fields, as Master Malvin sought to maximize production while market conditions remained favorable. Workers who had already endured months of backbreaking labor found themselves pushed to work even longer hours, with rest periods shortened and quotas increased to levels that tested human endurance. The plantation's sugar mill operated around the clock during peak harvest season, its machinery grinding raw cane into the granulated wealth that would finance another year of luxury for the Carraith family. The work was dangerous under normal circumstances. The mechanical presses and boiling cauldrons claimed fingers, hands, and sometimes lives with industrial indifference. Extended operation pushed both equipment and operators beyond safe limits, creating conditions that turned accidents into inevitabilities. Rovira learned of each injury and death through the network of whispered communication that connected the quarters to the mansion's domestic staff. Kaler Vinreth lost 3 fingers when exhaustion caused him to mishandle the cane press lever. Final Crestwind collapsed from heat exhaustion while tending the boiling sugar, her unconscious body suffering burns that would leave permanent scars. Old Lorian Dravok, who had worked the Belafonte fields for over 40 years, simply failed to wake up one morning, his heart finally surrendering to decades of brutal labor. Each tragedy was met with the same response from the Carraith family, a brief calculation of the financial impact, followed by adjustments to work assignments that maintained productivity levels regardless of human cost. Master Malvin's ledgers recorded these losses with the same dispassion he might show when documenting equipment failures or weather damage. The death of Lorian Dravok was noted as reduction in field labor capacity, alongside calculations for replacement acquisition costs. The mansion's atmosphere during this period reflected the family's increasing excitement about their financial success and social standing. Conversations at meals grew animated, as Master Malvin described his plans for expanding the plantation's operations, perhaps purchasing additional property in Texas or investing in New Orleans commercial ventures. Mistress Orlith discussed elaborate improvements to the mansion's interior, including new furniture from Europe and expanded entertaining spaces that would accommodate even larger social gatherings. Young Master Vorik spoke enthusiastically about modernizing the plantation's operations, implementing new agricultural techniques he had read about in northern industrial journals. His plans included mechanization that would increase efficiency while reducing the need for human labor, though his calculations focused solely on cost savings rather than the welfare of workers who might be displaced. The family's conversations revealed a complete disconnect between their prosperity and its human sources, as if the wealth they enjoyed materialized through natural processes rather than deliberate exploitation. The preparation for the harvest ball intensified this atmosphere of celebration and obliviousness. Mistress Orlith threw herself into planning what she intended to be the most magnificent social event in the plantation's history, commissioning new decorations, ordering exotic foods from New Orleans, and corresponding with neighboring plantation families about attendance and entertainment. The ball would showcase not just the Carraith family's wealth, but their position at the apex of Louisiana's agricultural aristocracy. Rovira found herself at the center of increasingly elaborate preparations, as Mistress Orlith demanded perfection in every detail of the evening's cuisine. The menu included dishes that required ingredients imported from across the globe, French wines, Caribbean spices, and delicacies that cost more than most enslaved families would see in years of labor. Each item represented not just culinary sophistication, but a demonstration of the family's ability to command resources from anywhere in the world through the accumulated profits of human bondage. The irony was not lost on Rovira as she prepared these extravagant meals, while the people who made such luxury possible survived on basic rations of cornmeal, salt pork, and whatever vegetables they could grow in small garden plots behind their cabins. The contrast became more stark as harvest season progressed, and food allocations to the quarters were reduced to free up resources for the ball's preparations. Families that had worked 18-hour days in the cane fields found their evening meals reduced to subsistence levels, while the mansion's pantries overflowed with delicacies for a single night's entertainment. The psychological pressure of serving people who displayed such casual indifference to human suffering began to manifest in ways that Rovira struggled to control. She found herself listening to family conversations with increasing anger, her hands trembling as she served meals to people who discussed the buying and selling of human beings between courses. The familiar routines of kitchen work became opportunities to imagine different outcomes, alternative endings to conversations she overheard about maximizing profits from human labor. Master Malvin's business meetings during this period revealed the calculating mindset that governed plantation operations with scientific precision. Rovira listened as he discussed breeding programs designed to increase his human inventory, evaluating which enslaved women might produce the most valuable offspring. She heard conversations about punishment strategies intended to maintain discipline without reducing productivity, calibrated to inflict maximum psychological impact while preserving the physical capacity for labor. The dehumanization inherent in these discussions was absolute and systematic. The Carraith family and their business associates spoke about human beings with the same terminology they used for livestock, evaluating breeding potential, discussing training methods, and calculating depreciation rates based on age and physical condition. The language itself revealed how completely they had stripped away the humanity of those they owned, reducing complex human lives to economic variables and profit calculations. One particularly disturbing conversation occurred during a dinner meeting with neighboring plantation owner Arundel Castro, who had come to discuss purchasing several enslaved families from Master Malvin. The negotiation proceeded like any commercial transaction, with discussions of pricing, delivery terms, and warranties on the human merchandise being transferred. Rovira served wine and cleared plates while listening to men debate the monetary value of people she knew personally, families who would be separated forever by business decisions made over imported delicacies. The casual cruelty of these transactions was enhanced by the social context in which they occurred. The same men who spent hours calculating the optimal purchase price for human beings would immediately shift to discussions of literature, politics, or agricultural innovation, demonstrating their capacity for intellectual sophistication in areas that didn't conflict with their economic interests. They were not ignorant or unsophisticated people. They had simply created moral frameworks that excluded enslaved people from consideration as human beings deserving of basic dignity. As October progressed and the harvest ball approached, Rovira began to understand that the celebration would represent more than just a social gathering. It would be a ritualistic affirmation of the system that held her and hundreds of others in bondage, a collective celebration of wealth built on human suffering, and a demonstration of power that extended far beyond individual plantation boundaries. The guest list included some of Louisiana's most influential political and economic leaders, men whose decisions shaped policies that maintained and expanded the institution of slavery throughout the South. The realization that she was preparing food for people who collectively owned thousands of human beings created a psychological pressure that Rovira found increasingly difficult to contain. Each preparation session became an exercise in controlled rage, as she chopped vegetables while imagining different targets for her knife, kneaded bread while visualizing other substances she might incorporate into the dough, and tended cooking fires while contemplating their potential applications beyond cuisine. The transformation in Rovira's consciousness during this period was invisible to those around her, hidden beneath the facade of competent service that had always characterized her work. But internally, she had moved beyond anger into a state of cold calculation, evaluating options and opportunities with the same systematic approach that Master Malvin applied to his business operations. The kitchen that had been her workplace was becoming something different, a laboratory where she could experiment with alternatives to passive acceptance of her circumstances. The harvest ball would bring together everyone responsible for maintaining the system that held her in bondage, gathering them in a single location where they would celebrate their collective prosperity while remaining completely vulnerable to someone with intimate knowledge of their habits, preferences, and blind spots. The irony was perfect. Their security depended entirely on the loyalty of people they treated as property, their lives protected only by the assumption that human beings could be broken completely enough to serve their oppressors faithfully even when given opportunities for revenge. As the final preparations for the ball intensified, Rovira began to see the approaching event not as a celebration she would serve, but as an opportunity she had been preparing for her entire life. The breaking point came on the evening of October 12th, 3 days before the harvest ball, when the autumn air still held the oppressive heat of summer and the mansion buzzed with final preparations for what Mistress Orlith promised would be the most spectacular social event in Louisiana plantation history. Rovira had spent 14 hours in the kitchen that day, preparing trial versions of elaborate dishes for the family's approval, her hands raw from kneading pastry and her back aching from hours bent over steaming pots. The familiar exhaustion should have dulled her senses, but instead it seemed to sharpen her awareness as she moved through her evening duties with mechanical precision. Master Malvin had called a business meeting that evening, gathering his sons and several neighboring plantation owners in the mansion's library to discuss matters that would shape the region's agricultural future. The meeting included Arundel Castro from the Willow Creek Plantation, Fendrel Caro from Spanish Oak Estates, and Malden Cresttown, whose riverside holdings made him one of Louisiana's wealthiest planters. These men collectively owned over 2,000 human beings and controlled vast fortunes built on sugar, cotton, and rice cultivation. Rovira served brandy and cigars to the assembled planters, her presence so familiar and expected that the men spoke freely in front of her, as if she were a piece of furniture rather than a human being capable of understanding their words. The conversations that followed would shatter whatever remained of her illusions about gradual improvement in her circumstances, revealing the systematic calculations that governed every aspect of enslaved people's lives with scientific precision. The discussion began with Master Malvin's announcement of his most profitable harvest season in the plantation's history, news that was met with congratulations and requests for details about his methods. As brandy loosened tongues and cigar smoke filled the air, the conversation evolved into a technical discussion of labor management strategies that treated human beings as agricultural equipment, requiring calibration and maintenance. The key to maximizing productivity, Master Malvin explained, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had reduced human suffering to mathematical formulas, lies in precise calculation of input costs versus output value. Feed them enough to maintain working capacity, but not enough to reduce dependency. Provide sufficient shelter to prevent illness that might impact productivity, but nothing that might create comfort or security. Arundel Castro nodded approvingly, adding his own observations from years of plantation management. I've found that periodic separation of families serves multiple purposes. It prevents the formation of emotional bonds that might lead to collective resistance, while also demonstrating the absolute nature of our control over their circumstances. The psychological impact is far more effective than physical punishment in maintaining long-term compliance. The casual nature of this conversation, conducted while Rovira refilled crystal glasses with liquor that cost more than most enslaved families would see in months of labor, revealed the complete dehumanization that underpinned the plantation system. These men were not discussing abstract economic theories, they were describing deliberate strategies for maximizing suffering while maintaining the facade of paternalistic care. Fendril Caro contributed his own expertise, gleaned from managing over 600 enslaved people across multiple properties. The breeding programs require particular attention to genetic considerations. Select for physical strength and docility while avoiding intelligence that might lead to troublesome independence. Document bloodlines carefully to prevent inbreeding that might reduce the value of offspring. The conversation continued for over an hour, with each planter sharing techniques for extracting maximum labor while minimizing costs. They discussed optimal caloric intake calculations, housing designs that prevented privacy or comfort, work schedules that maintained productivity while preventing rest, and punishment systems that created psychological trauma without reducing physical capacity for labor. Every aspect of enslaved people's lives had been analyzed, quantified, and optimized for profit. Rovira's hands trembled as she collected empty glasses, her composure maintained through years of practice, even as their words struck her like physical blows. These men were not evil in any dramatic sense. They were intelligent, educated, and even cultured individuals who had simply created moral frameworks that excluded certain categories of human beings from consideration. They discussed the systematic destruction of families with the same detachment they might show when evaluating crop rotation strategies. The most devastating moment came when Master Malvin addressed the question of long-term planning for the plantation's human inventory. His words, delivered while he selected a fresh cigar from an ornate humidor, would echo in Rovira's memory for the rest of her life. The current generation of workers is aging out of peak productivity, he observed with clinical detachment. We need to accelerate breeding programs while simultaneously culling the older, less productive individuals. Market conditions suggest that prices for prime field hands will continue rising, making it more economical to breed our own replacement labor rather than purchasing on the open market. Malden Cresttown agreed, adding his own calculations to the discussion. I've been implementing systematic separation of mothers from offspring at age 10. Early separation prevents the formation of emotional attachments that might interfere with training, while also freeing the mothers for additional breeding cycles. The psychological trauma is temporary, but the economic benefits are permanent. The discussion that followed included detailed analysis of breeding schedules, genetic selection criteria, and methods for preventing emotional bonds that might reduce the efficiency of human livestock management. These men were planning the systematic destruction of families, the deliberate creation of psychological trauma, and the reduction of human beings to breeding stock, all while enjoying luxuries purchased with the profits of their cruelty. Rovira's vision blurred as she absorbed the implications of their words. Her own mother, who had raised her with love despite impossible circumstances, was seen by these men as nothing more than a breeding animal whose emotional capacity for maternal attachment represented an inefficiency to be eliminated. The families in the quarters, who had maintained their humanity through decades of dehumanizing treatment, were viewed as genetic material to be optimized for economic return. The conversation revealed that her situation would not improve through patience, loyalty, or exceptional service. The system that held her in bondage was not a temporary condition to be endured, but a permanent structure designed to extract maximum value from human life while preventing any possibility of dignity or autonomy. These men had created a scientific approach to human exploitation that was designed to perpetuate itself across generations. As the meeting concluded and the planters prepared to leave, Master Malvin made an announcement that crystallized Rovira's understanding of her circumstances. The Harvest Ball will provide an excellent opportunity to demonstrate our management techniques to potential investors. Several gentlemen from Texas and Mississippi have expressed interest in our breeding programs and labor optimization strategies. Success breeds imitation, and our methods could revolutionize plantation operations throughout the South. The Harvest Ball, which Rovira had been preparing for weeks, would not simply be a social celebration. It would be a showcase for the systematic methods that had reduced her and hundreds of others to livestock, a demonstration intended to spread their techniques to other plantations across the region. The men she had served that evening would use the ball to promote the expansion of their dehumanizing practices, potentially condemning thousands more human beings to the same systematic exploitation. As Rovira cleaned up after the meeting, collecting glasses that still held the scent of expensive brandy and emptying ashtrays filled with Cuban cigar remnants, she felt something fundamental shift in her consciousness. The patient endurance her mother had taught her, the hope for gradual improvement through faithful service, the belief that exceptional performance might earn better treatment. All of these strategies for survival collapsed under the weight of what she had witnessed. These men had revealed themselves to be architects of systematic cruelty, designers of a machine for extracting wealth from human suffering, scientists who had reduced love, family, and dignity to variables in profit calculations. They were not simply products of their time or victims of flawed social systems. They were active creators and promoters of human misery, committed to expanding their methods and perpetuating their control across generations. The kitchen where Rovira had spent her life seemed different as she completed her evening duties. The knives appeared sharper, the fires burned hotter, and the various chemical supplies took on new significance. Her intimate knowledge of the mansion's layout, the family's routines, and their complete dependence on her loyal service suddenly revealed possibilities that had been invisible before this evening's revelation. As she banked the cooking fires and secured the kitchen for the night, Rovira understood that she had reached a decision point that would define the rest of her existence, however long or short it might prove to be. She could continue serving people who saw her as breeding stock to be optimized, or she could use her unique position and accumulated knowledge to create a different ending to their story. The Harvest Ball would gather together the region's most powerful plantation owners in a single location, where they would celebrate their collective prosperity while remaining completely vulnerable to someone they had trained themselves to overlook. The irony was perfect. Their security depended entirely on the loyalty of people they had systematically dehumanized, their lives protected only by the assumption that human beings could be broken completely enough to serve their oppressors faithfully, even when given perfect opportunities for revenge. As Rovira walked back to the quarters that night, her decision crystallized with the clarity that comes from abandoning hope for gradual change and embracing the possibility of dramatic transformation. The Harvest Ball would not be a celebration she would serve. It would be an opportunity she had been preparing for her entire life, a chance to demonstrate that some forms of justice required fire to achieve proper purification. October 15th dawned with the oppressive humidity that characterized Louisiana autumns, the air thick enough to taste, while Spanish moss hung motionless from ancient oak trees like funeral shrouds waiting for their purpose to be revealed. Rovira rose before the servant bells rang, her movements deliberate and calm as she began what she knew would be either the last day of her enslavement or the last day of her life. The distinction had ceased to matter sometime during the sleepless hours she had spent staring at the cabin ceiling, calculating distances, timing, and the precise sequence of actions that would transform the Carraith family's celebration into their funeral pyre. The kitchen bustled with controlled chaos as preparation for the evening's feast reached its crescendo, but Rovira moved through the familiar routines with an eerie tranquility that went unnoticed by the other enslaved workers caught up in their own urgent tasks. She supervised the preparation of elaborate canapés, directed the arrangement of silver serving pieces, and coordinated the timing of multiple courses with the same meticulous attention to detail that had always characterized her work. The irony was not lost on her that she was applying the same organizational skills that made her valuable as a servant to orchestrate the destruction of those she served. Throughout the morning, Rovira conducted a methodical inventory of resources that would serve purposes beyond their intended functions. The lamp oil stored in the pantry for evening illumination could accelerate combustion when properly distributed. The cleaning alcohol used to polish silver could create flashpoints that would spread fire faster than water could extinguish it. The cooking oils accumulated for food preparation would burn with sustained intensity once ignited. Each substance represented a tool in an arsenal that had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with sufficient knowledge and determination to recognize its potential. The mansion's layout, which she had navigated daily for years without conscious thought, revealed itself as a map of vulnerabilities when viewed through the lens of destruction rather than service. The servants, stairs that allowed discrete movement between floors connected to the main structure at multiple points, creating pathways for spreading fire throughout the building's interior. The dumbwaiter system used to transport food between kitchen and dining areas provided access to the mansion's core without exposure to main corridors where guests might notice unusual activity. Master Malvin's study, where the previous evening's business meeting had revealed the systematic nature of his cruelty, occupied a corner room filled with account books, correspondence, and financial documents that represented the written history of human exploitation. The room's wooden shelves, leather-bound volumes, and Persian carpets would burn with particular satisfaction, erasing the records that reduced human beings to profit calculations while consuming the profits themselves. The symbolic justice of destroying the evidence of their crimes in the same fire that claimed their lives appealed to Rovira's sense of poetic balance. As afternoon progressed toward evening, the mansion transformed into a showcase of Southern hospitality and cultural refinement. Fresh flowers from the plantation's gardens filled crystal vases, while candles in elaborate silver holders cast warm light across surfaces that reflected generations of accumulated wealth. The dining room table stretched beneath the weight of china, crystal, and silver that represented fortunes beyond imagination, all purchased with the profits of human bondage and maintained by enslaved hands that would never own such luxuries. The arriving guests represented the apex of Louisiana's plantation aristocracy, families whose names appeared on bank records, political documents, and social registers that shaped the state's economic and cultural landscape. Their carriages filled the circular drive while their personal servants unloaded trunks and coordinated accommodations for an evening of celebration that would extend well past midnight. Each family brought their own domestic staff, swelling the mansion's population with additional witnesses to what was about to unfold. Rovira observed the gathering with the detached interest of someone studying targets rather than serving guests, noting details that would influence her timing and methodology. The men clustered in Master Malvin's study, drinking imported brandy while discussing business ventures that would expand their collective control over human lives. The women gathered in the main parlor, their conversation focused on social events and domestic management strategies that treated enslaved people as domestic appliances, requiring occasional maintenance and replacement. The evening's entertainment followed predictable patterns that Rovira had observed at previous social gatherings, but this time she watched with the calculating attention of someone planning to interrupt the proceedings permanently. Dancing would begin around 8 o'clock, drawing guests to the ballroom where musicians provided accompaniment for waltzes and country dances. Dinner would be served at 9, requiring her presence in the dining room to coordinate service with the expanded staff. The evening would reach its peak around 10:30, when toasts and speeches would celebrate the year's agricultural success and plans for future prosperity. That moment, when the guests would be most concentrated in the mansion's central areas and most distracted by their own congratulations, would provide the optimal window for action. The servant stairs would be largely empty as staff focused on clearing dinner service, while the main corridors would be filled with guests too intoxicated and entertained to notice unusual activity. The timing had to be precise. Too early, and the fire might be discovered before it gained sufficient momentum. Too late, and guests might begin departing before the flames could prevent their escape. As the sun set behind the cypress trees that bordered the plantation's western boundary, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns, Rovira began the final phase of her preparation. She moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, collecting the materials she had identified throughout the day and distributing them to strategic locations where they would remain unnoticed until needed. Small bottles of lamp oil disappeared into the pockets of her serving dress, while containers of cleaning alcohol found temporary homes behind furniture and inside storage cabinets. The mansion's servants moved through their evening routines with the synchronized precision of a well-rehearsed performance, their familiarity with each other's responsibilities creating opportunities for individual action without immediate scrutiny. Rovira's position as head kitchen supervisor gave her authority to move through areas that might be questioned if accessed by lower-ranking staff, while her reputation for reliability meant that her temporary absences would be attributed to the complex logistics of managing such an elaborate event. The dinner service proceeded with the flawless execution that characterized all Belafonte social entertainments, each course appearing at precisely the scheduled moment, while guests praised the sophistication of the cuisine and the elegance of the presentation. Rovira supervised the service with her customary attention to detail, ensuring that every guest's preferences were accommodated and every serving piece properly maintained. The conversation she overheard during this final meal would remain with her forever. Casual discussions of human breeding programs interspersed with appreciation for French wines, debates about labor management strategies accompanied by compliments on the evening's musical entertainment. As the dinner plates were cleared and guests prepared to resume dancing in the ballroom, Rovira excused herself from the kitchen under the pretense of checking candle levels in the mansion's upper floors. The excuse was both plausible and ironic. She would indeed be dealing with flames, though not in the manner her fellow staff members might expect. Her movement through the servants' stairs was unhurried and purposeful, carrying her to the second floor where Master Malvin's study waited in darkness. The study felt different in the evening shadows, its familiar furnishings taking on ominous significance as Rovira began her methodical work. She started with the account books that documented the buying and selling of human beings, dousing the leather-bound volumes with lamp oil, while reflecting on the lives those pages had reduced to financial transactions. The correspondence files that contained breeding schedules and punishment records received similar treatment, their contents destined to become ash and smoke rather than evidence of systematic cruelty. The Persian carpets that covered the study's floors had been woven by skilled craftsmen thousands of miles away, their intricate patterns representing months of labor by people who would never see the rooms their work decorated. Now those same carpets would serve as accelerants, their wool fibers and expensive dyes, creating a foundation of combustible material that would ensure rapid flames spread throughout the room. Rovira worked with the methodical precision of someone following a plan rehearsed countless times in her imagination, each action building toward the moment of ignition. The wooden shelves that lined the study's walls held books on agricultural science, political philosophy, and classical literature that demonstrated Master Malvin's intellectual sophistication in areas that didn't conflict with his economic interests. These volumes would burn alongside the account books, their pages contributing to a fire that would erase both the evidence and the justification for human exploitation. The irony satisfied Rovira's sense of justice. The same learning that had enabled systematic cruelty would fuel its destruction. From the study, Rovira moved to other strategic locations throughout the mansion's upper floor, distributing accelerants and preparing ignition points that would create multiple fires simultaneously once the process began. The master bedroom, where decisions about buying and selling human beings had been made between silk sheets, received particular attention. The expensive fabrics and imported furniture would burn with the same intensity regardless of their original cost, democracy being the only gift that fire offered to rich and poor alike. The children's rooms posed a moment of hesitation in Rovira's otherwise methodical preparation, memories of serving these people during their innocence creating brief uncertainty about including them in her plan for justice. But the conversations she had overheard about breeding programs and genetic selection reminded her that innocence in this context was temporary. These individuals would grow up to become the next generation of human exploiters, inheriting both the wealth and the moral blindness that made systematic cruelty possible. As she completed her preparation of the upper floors, the sounds of music and laughter drifted up from the ballroom below, creating a surreal contrast between celebration and impending destruction. The guests were reaching the peak of their evening's enjoyment, their conversation growing more animated as alcohol loosened tongues and lowered inhibitions. Soon they would begin the toasts that celebrated another year of prosperity built on human suffering, providing the perfect moment for their celebration to be transformed into something entirely different. Rovira descended the servants' stairs for the final time, her movements calm and purposeful as she approached the moment that would define the rest of her existence. In her pocket she carried the simple sulfur matches that would transform preparation into action, planning into execution. The kitchen's cooking fires would provide the initial flame, but the matches would carry that fire to locations where it could accomplish work that went far beyond cuisine. The grandfather clock in the foyer chimed 10:15 as Rovira reached the main floor, its measured tones marking time that was running out for everyone in the mansion. In the ballroom, Master Malvin was preparing to offer the evening's first formal toast, gathering his guests around him while servants filled crystal glasses with champagne imported specifically for this moment of triumph. The toast would celebrate the harvest that had made this gathering possible, the prosperity that justified their social prominence, and the system that ensured their continued dominance over hundreds of human lives. But as Master Malvin raised his glass and began to speak about the blessings of another successful year, Rovira was already moving through the mansion's lower floors with matches in hand, carrying fire to locations where it would begin the work of transforming celebration into judgment, prosperity into ashes, and masters into equals in the most democratic force known to humanity. The first flames caught the oil-soaked curtains in Master Malvin's study with a hunger that seemed almost alive, orange tongues racing up the expensive fabric toward the ceiling while consuming financial records that had reduced human beings to livestock entries and account ledgers. Within minutes, the fire had spread to the wooden bookshelves, devouring leather-bound volumes on agricultural science and human management with equal enthusiasm. The Persian carpets beneath caught next, their wool fibers and imported dyes creating a foundation of intense heat that would make the room uninhabitable within moments of discovery. From the study, flames followed the trails of accelerant that Rovira had carefully distributed throughout the mansion's upper floors, racing through servant corridors and climbing the walls with methodical precision. The master bedroom erupted in fire, as silk bedding and imported furniture provided perfect fuel for combustion that grew stronger with each passing moment. The children's rooms followed in rapid succession, their expensive toys and hand-carved furniture contributing to a blaze that recognized no distinction between innocent and guilty when both lived in houses built on human suffering. In the ballroom below, Master Malvin's toast continued uninterrupted for nearly 10 minutes as the upper floors burned above the guests' heads, the mansion's thick walls and closed doors containing both smoke and sound well enough to delay discovery. The plantation's most prominent families raised their glasses in celebration of another profitable harvest season, their laughter and conversation masking the crackling sounds that would soon demand their complete attention. The irony was perfect. They toasted their success while the evidence of their systematic cruelty burned away overhead. The first sign of trouble came when smoke began seeping through gaps around the ballroom ceiling, creating thin gray wisps that initially went unnoticed among the tobacco haze from expensive cigars. Young Master Sylvan was the first to comment on what he assumed was a problem with the fireplace ventilation, his casual observation about poor air circulation prompting others to glance upward at accumulating smoke that was growing thicker with each passing moment. Orlith Denevar Coreth noticed the acrid smell next, her refined senses detecting something far more alarming than wood smoke from the mansion's many fireplaces. The scent carried undertones of burning wool, silk, and leather that suggested combustion far beyond normal heating fires. Her sharp intake of breath and sudden pallor caught her husband's attention, interrupting his toast mid-sentence as he followed her gaze toward the ceiling where smoke was now visibly accumulating. The realization struck the assembled guests with the force of physical impact, their celebratory mood transforming instantly into panic as the smell of burning fabric and the sight of thickening smoke revealed the magnitude of their danger. Conversation stopped mid-sentence while champagne glasses crashed to the floor, their crystal fragments mixing with silk slippers as guests rushed toward the ballroom's exits in growing desperation. Master Malvin's commanding voice, which had ordered the lives of hundreds of human beings with absolute authority, cracked with panic as he shouted instructions that no one followed in the chaos of their escape attempts. The main staircase, their primary route to the upper floors where family members might be trapped, was already impassable as flames roared down from above with increasing intensity. The servants' stairs, which Rovira had used for her final preparations, were completely consumed by fire that blocked any possibility of reaching the mansion's second story. The guests who had entered the Belafonte mansion as masters of the agricultural universe now found themselves trapped like animals, their refined manners and cultural sophistication providing no protection against the democratic nature of fire that consumed rich and poor with equal enthusiasm. The ballroom's tall windows, designed to showcase the family's wealth and provide elegant views of manicured gardens, became their only hope of escape as smoke filled the air with toxic thickness. Arundel Castro and Fendrel Caro worked together to break the ballroom's lead glass windows, using silver candlesticks as improvised hammers while their wives gathered silk skirts and prepared for drops that would challenge their physical capabilities. The windows were designed for beauty rather than emergency exits, their height above the ground creating distances that promised broken bones for anyone desperate enough to jump. Yet as smoke grew thicker and heat more intense, that dangerous drop became preferable to certain death by fire. The plantation's enslaved population had gathered outside the burning mansion within minutes of the first flames becoming visible through upper-story windows, their response to the disaster revealing the complex emotions created by witnessing their oppressors' destruction. Some ran toward the house with buckets of water, their instinct to help overriding years of abuse and degradation. Others stood motionless in the falling ash, watching the systematic cruelty that had defined their lives literally go up in smoke. Sarah, an elderly woman who had served the Corioth family for over 40 years, found herself frozen between conflicting impulses as she watched flames consume the mansion where she had labored without compensation since childhood. Part of her wanted to rush inside and save the people who had owned her body and soul for decades, while another part recognized this moment as divine justice for crimes that no earthly court would ever prosecute. The paralysis created by these opposing forces left her standing in silence, while others made their choices about rescue attempts. The younger enslaved men organized bucket brigades despite their conflicted feelings about saving their oppressors, their efforts hampered by equipment designed for normal fires, rather than the systematic conflagration that Rovira had created. The well water they threw against the mansion's exterior walls evaporated before it could significantly impact flames that had gained too much momentum and consumed too much fuel to be contained by conventional firefighting methods. Thomas Bingham, the plantation's overseer, arrived at the scene to find complete chaos as guests leaped from windows while enslaved people stood in confused groups, uncertain whether they should help save the people who had brutalized them for years. His authority, which had been absolute in managing the plantation's daily operations, proved useless in directing rescue efforts that required cooperation from people he had spent his career oppressing. The enslaved population no longer responded to his shouted commands with the automatic obedience that the plantation system had created through decades of conditioning. By midnight, the Belafonte mansion's collapse was complete, its 3 stories of accumulated wealth and refinement reduced to a foundation filled with glowing coals and twisted metal. The grand staircase where guests had made elegant entrances to lavish parties had become a pile of charred timber and melted brass fixtures. The ballroom where Louisiana's agricultural elite had celebrated their prosperity was now an open space filled with ash and the scattered remains of crystal chandeliers that had once illuminated their gatherings. The human cost of the fire proved devastating for Louisiana's plantation aristocracy. Master Melvin and Mistress Orlith had died in their bedroom, overcome by smoke while attempting to reach a window that was too high and too small for escape. Young Master Vorick perished in the hallway outside his parents' room, apparently trying to help them flee the flames. His brother Sylvan survived the initial fire but died from injuries sustained when he jumped from a second-story window, his body found in the gardens where he had crawled before succumbing to internal bleeding. Among the guests, the casualties included some of Louisiana's most prominent plantation owners and their families. Arundel Castro's wife died from smoke inhalation after becoming trapped in the mansion's parlor, while Fendrel Caro suffered burns over 60% of his body that would prove fatal within a week. The social and economic impact of these deaths rippled through Louisiana's agricultural community, disrupting business relationships and family alliances that had shaped the state's political landscape for decades. Sheriff Marcus Tharvin arrived at dawn to find the smoldering ruins of what had been one of Louisiana's grandest plantation houses, its destruction representing not just a tragic fire, but a challenge to the social order that had defined Southern society for generations. His investigation would need to determine whether the blaze had been accidental or deliberate, a distinction that carried implications far beyond individual criminal liability. If the fire had been set intentionally, it suggested that enslaved people possessed both the knowledge and the courage to strike back against their oppressors with deadly effectiveness. The surviving enslaved population presented a wall of silent ignorance when questioned about the fire's origins, their responses revealing nothing about how the blaze had started or who might have been responsible for its systematic spread throughout the mansion. They had spent their lives perfecting the art of seeing nothing and knowing nothing when questioned by white authorities, skills that now served to protect whatever secrets might exist about the night's events. Dr. Benjamin Hayes, the parish coroner, conducted examinations of the victims that revealed death by smoke inhalation in most cases, with some additional fatalities from injuries sustained during escape attempts. His findings suggested that the fire had spread too quickly for most occupants to reach safety, but the systematic nature of the destruction made accidental causes seem increasingly unlikely. The simultaneous ignition of multiple floors suggested deliberate planning, rather than a single candle or fireplace spark that had gotten out of control. The question that haunted Sheriff Tharvin's investigation was the complete absence of Rovira Thalrose, the head kitchen servant whose body was nowhere to be found among the mansion's ruins. Her fellow workers claimed she had been helping with cleanup after the evening's dinner service, but no one could account for her whereabouts when the fire began or explain how she had managed to escape when so many others had perished. The timing of her disappearance coincided perfectly with the fire's onset, creating suspicions that demanded investigation despite the potential consequences of pursuing such inquiries. The broader implications of treating an enslaved person as a potential suspect in the murder of white plantation owners created legal and social complications that Louisiana's authorities preferred not to address. Acknowledging that someone classified as property might possess the intelligence, opportunity, and motivation to orchestrate such sophisticated revenge would challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of human bondage and the security of the plantation system. Within a week of the fire, an official report attributed the disaster to an unattended candle in Master Malvin's study, a conclusion that satisfied no one but protected everyone from uncomfortable questions about the true nature of the relationship between enslaved people and their oppressors. The report made no mention of accelerant patterns, systematic fire distribution, or the suspicious absence of key household staff members whose survival or death remained undetermined. The Bellefonte Plantation's 412 formerly enslaved people found themselves technically free due to their owner's death, but practically stranded in a legal system that provided no framework for supporting people who had been classified as property rather than persons. Some remained on the plantation grounds, uncertain where else they could go or how they might survive without the brutal but predictable structure that had governed their entire lives. Others disappeared into Louisiana's swamps and forests, seeking freedom in places where no law could reach them, but where survival remained uncertain. The fire's impact on Louisiana's plantation society extended far beyond the immediate casualties, creating a climate of fear and suspicion that would persist for years. Plantation owners throughout the region began sleeping with loaded weapons, installing additional locks on their houses, and implementing security measures designed to prevent the kind of intimate access that had made the Bellefonte fire possible. The absolute trust they had placed in their enslaved populations evaporated, replaced by constant vigilance that transformed their comfortable homes into armed camps. The legend of the Bellefonte fire began to take shape within weeks of the mansion's destruction, carried through the underground network of communication that connected enslaved populations across Louisiana's plantation districts, like invisible threads binding communities separated by miles of hostile territory. The story traveled through cotton fields and sugarcane rows, whispered during brief rest periods, and shared in the darkness of quarters where exhausted people gathered to process the day's labor and dream of different possibilities. In these tellings, Rovira Thalrose transformed from a missing kitchen servant into something approaching mythology, a figure who had demonstrated that the powerful were as vulnerable as anyone else when confronted by someone with sufficient knowledge, opportunity, and determination to act. The details of her disappearance remained mysterious, with some accounts claiming she had perished in the flames she set, while others insisted she had escaped into Louisiana's vast swamplands, where tracking would prove impossible even for professional slave catchers. The most persistent version of the legend held that Rovira had survived the fire and continued moving through the region, appearing at plantation houses where cruelty reached levels that demanded intervention. These stories described a woman who could walk through flames unburned, who possessed intimate knowledge of every plantation's vulnerabilities, and who carried justice in her hands like burning coals ready to ignite wherever oppression grew too systematic to ignore. Whether these accounts reflected reality or represented the collective wishful thinking of people desperate for hope mattered less than their psychological impact on both enslaved and enslaving populations throughout the South. The stories created a sense that resistance was possible, that knowledge could be weaponized against oppression, and that no amount of wealth or social position could provide absolute protection against the consequences of systematic cruelty. By 1854, plantation houses across 3 Louisiana parishes had burned under circumstances that bore striking similarities to the Belafonte fire. The Magnolia Grove mansion of the Dravic family was consumed during their spring social gathering, while the River Oaks estate belonging to the Feldrin family burned during a summer dinner party that had been celebrating their most profitable harvest in decades. Each fire displayed the same systematic spread pattern, the same evidence of accelerant distribution, and the same mysterious absence of key domestic staff whose bodies were never recovered from the ruins. The authorities' response to these incidents followed the same pattern established after the Belafonte fire, with official reports attributing each disaster to accidental causes, while privately acknowledging the systematic nature of what appeared to be a coordinated campaign of arson. Sheriff Tharvin found himself investigating fires that shared too many characteristics to be coincidental. Yet pursuing those connections would require acknowledging that enslaved people possessed both the intelligence and the organizational capacity to coordinate resistance across multiple plantations. The economic impact of these fires extended far beyond the direct property losses, creating a crisis of confidence in the plantation system that rippled through Louisiana's agricultural economy. Insurance companies refused to provide coverage for plantation houses, citing unexplainable combustion risks that made such properties uninsurable. Banks grew reluctant to finance agricultural operations that might disappear overnight, while northern investors began questioning the stability of enterprises built on the forced labor of people who demonstrated increasing willingness to fight back. The social consequences proved equally significant as Louisiana's planting elite discovered that their comfortable assumptions about human nature and social hierarchy could not withstand systematic challenges to their authority. The elaborate dinner parties and social gatherings that had defined their cultural identity became exercises in paranoia, with hosts constantly monitoring their domestic staff for signs of disloyalty, while guests wondered whether each invitation might be their last. Dr. Hayes, the parish coroner who had examined victims from multiple plantation fires, began keeping private records that told a different story than his official reports suggested. His personal journals, discovered after his death in 1867, contained detailed observations about burn patterns, victim locations, and suspicious circumstances that pointed towards systematic arson rather than the accidental causes his public documents claimed. "The fires follow patterns too precise to be coincidental," Hayes wrote in an entry dated August 1855. "Each incident targets plantations known for particular brutality, as if guided by intelligence networks that transcend normal communication channels. I begin to suspect we are witnessing not isolated acts of revenge, but organized resistance that challenges our fundamental assumptions about the nature of human bondage." The legend of Rovira Thalrose continued to evolve throughout the 1850s, with new details added to each retelling that reflected the hopes and fears of different communities. Enslaved populations spoke of her as a liberator who appeared whenever injustice reached levels that demanded intervention, while plantation owners whispered about a vengeful spirit that embodied their collective guilt for crimes that no earthly court would prosecute. Some accounts described her as a woman who had mastered fire itself, walking through flames that consumed her enemies while leaving her unharmed. Others claimed she had learned to become invisible, moving through plantation houses without detection while preparing the instruments of their destruction. The most elaborate version suggested she had gained supernatural powers through her willingness to sacrifice everything for justice, transforming from human being into a force of nature that could not be stopped or captured. The brass keys that investigators found at each fire site became objects of particular fascination and fear. Plantation owners speculated that these items were signals between conspirators, evidence of an underground network that coordinated resistance activities across vast distances. Enslaved communities saw them as symbols of liberation, representations of the power to unlock chains that bound not just bodies but spirits to conditions of permanent degradation. These keys, discovered among ashes that had consumed everything else, defied logical explanation in ways that enhanced their symbolic power. Each was identical in design despite being found at different locations months apart. suggesting either supernatural intervention or manufacturing capabilities that should not have existed among enslaved populations. The mystery of their origins added to the legend while creating practical security concerns for plantation owners who could never be certain whether such keys might unlock their own destruction. The impact of the Belafonte fire and its aftermath extended beyond Louisiana's borders, as news of the systematic plantation fires spread through both enslaved communities and abolitionist networks throughout the South. Frederick Douglass wrote extensively about what he termed divine retribution visited upon the houses of bondage, while Harriet Beecher Stowe incorporated similar incidents into novels that brought national attention to the capacity for resistance among enslaved populations. The fires had transcended local crime to become symbols in the growing national debate about slavery's moral legitimacy and practical sustainability. Northern abolitionists cited them as evidence that the institution of bondage carried within it the seeds of its own destruction, while Southern defenders argued that such incidents proved the need for harsher control measures to prevent future rebellions. By 1857, the systematic plantation fires had largely ceased, ending as mysteriously as they had begun, and leaving behind only legends and the lingering question of what had happened to their architect. Some accounts suggested that Rovira had finally perished in flames she had set for others, achieving in death the justice that life had denied her. Others claimed she had escaped to the north using underground networks that spirited formerly enslaved people to freedom in Canada and beyond. The most persistent legend held that she had simply disappeared into Louisiana's vast wilderness areas, living in swamplands and forests where no law could reach her but where her knowledge of fire and its applications remained available to others who might need such expertise. Travelers through remote areas of Louisiana reported glimpses of a woman moving through morning mists, while plantation owners in isolated locations sometimes discovered small fires that burned themselves out without spreading, interpreted as warnings rather than attacks. The Civil War that erupted in 1861 overshadowed these earlier acts of resistance, but historians now recognize them as crucial precursors to the larger conflict that would ultimately end the institution of slavery throughout the United States. The plantation fires had demonstrated that enslaved people could and would fight back against their oppressors, using whatever tools and opportunities became available, challenging assumptions about passive acceptance that had sustained the system for generations. Modern visitors to what was once the Belafonte plantation find only an empty field where sugarcane once grew and a solitary brick chimney that marks where the great house stood before Rovira Thalrose transformed celebration into judgment. Local residents avoid the area after dark, claiming they can still smell wood smoke on winter nights when the wind blows from the direction of the old foundations. They say that on October 15th each year, when autumn mists rise from the Mississippi River and Spanish moss hangs motionless from ancient oaks, you can see the glow of flames that cast no heat and hear the sound of footsteps moving with purpose through the darkness. Whether these phenomena represent actual supernatural activity or psychological projections of collective memory matters less than their continued power to evoke the night when one woman's courage transformed the comfortable assumptions of an entire social system. The brass key discovered in the Belafonte ruins was eventually acquired by the Louisiana State Museum, where it resides in a collection dedicated to artifacts from the antebellum period. Museum visitors often comment on the object's unusual preservation, noting that despite its age and the circumstances of its discovery, the metal shows no signs of heat damage or corrosion. The intricate engravings remain as sharp as the day they were carved, depicting symbols whose meaning has been lost to time but whose craftsmanship suggests origins far more sophisticated than plantation blacksmith work. Some scholars believe the key represents evidence of organized resistance networks that operated throughout the antebellum South, coordinating activities across distances that should have made such communication impossible. Others suggest it may be connected to African spiritual traditions that enslaved people maintained despite systematic attempts to destroy their cultural heritage. The mystery remains unsolved, adding to the legend of Rovira Thalrose and the night she proved that some forms of justice require fire to achieve proper purification. The Belafonte fire stands as a reminder that history's most comfortable narratives often exclude the voices of those who paid its highest costs, and that resistance takes forms that official records prefer not to acknowledge. Whether Rovira Thalrose survived her night of justice or perished in flames she had set for others, Her legacy endures in the understanding that no system of oppression can survive indefinitely when it creates the conditions for its own destruction. 171 years have passed since the Belafonte mansion burned on that October night in 1852, yet the questions raised by Rovira Thalrose's transformation from servant to architect of destruction continue to challenge our understanding of justice, resistance, and the price of systematic oppression. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about what happens when human beings are pushed beyond the boundaries of endurance, when patience becomes complicity, and when the only remaining choice lies between accepting degradation or embracing destruction. The historical record offers no definitive answers about Rovira's ultimate fate, leaving space for legend to fill the gaps that documentation cannot address. Perhaps she perished in the flames she set, achieving in death the dignity that life had denied her. Perhaps she escaped into Louisiana's wilderness, carrying fire in her hands and justice in her heart, to other places where cruelty had grown too systematic to ignore. Perhaps she became something beyond individual existence, transforming into an idea that could not be captured, killed, or contained by those who preferred their victims to remain passive. What cannot be disputed is the impact of her choice on both the immediate community and the broader struggle for human freedom that would culminate in civil war less than a decade after the Belafonte fire. She demonstrated that knowledge could be weaponized against oppression, that intimate familiarity with power structures could become the foundation for their destruction, and that no amount of wealth or social position could provide absolute protection against the consequences of systematic cruelty. The brass key that survived the fire continues to puzzle historians and visitors alike. Its perfect preservation, despite exposure to temperatures that should have destroyed or deformed any metal object. Some see it as evidence of supernatural intervention, while others view it as proof of resistance networks more sophisticated than official histories have acknowledged. The truth may be simpler and more profound, that certain objects, like certain stories, possess power that transcends their material composition. Modern visitors to the site often report experiences that logic cannot explain, but emotion recognizes as authentic. The smell of wood smoke on windless nights, the sound of footsteps moving through empty fields, the sensation of being watched by eyes that see beyond the surface of things. Whether these phenomena represent actual supernatural activity or psychological projections of collective memory matters less than their continued capacity to evoke the night when one woman's courage challenged an entire system of human exploitation. The Belafonte fire stands as a reminder that resistance takes many forms, not all of them recognized by official histories that prefer their narratives clean and their heroes conventional. Rovira Thalrose chose fire as her instrument of justice, but others have chosen words, laws, music, or simple refusal to cooperate with systems designed to destroy their humanity. Each form of resistance carries its own risks and moral complexities, but all share the common element of human beings refusing to accept circumstances that deny their fundamental dignity. Her legacy lives not in monuments or official commemorations, but in the understanding that oppression contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction. Every system built on the systematic degradation of human beings creates the conditions for its eventual challenge, whether through gradual reform or dramatic transformation. The choice of methods belongs to those who suffer under such systems, and their decisions deserve recognition rather than judgment from those who have never faced similar circumstances. The fire that consumed the Belafonte mansion on October 15, 1852 was not the end of Rovira's story, but its transformation into something larger than any individual life. She became proof that even the most powerless people possess the capacity to change history, that knowledge and opportunity can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds, and that justice sometimes requires fire to achieve proper purification. In a world that still struggles with questions of power, resistance, and moral responsibility, the legend of Rovira Thalrose remains relevant not as a blueprint for action, but as a reminder of what happens when human beings are pushed beyond their breaking points. Her story asks us to consider not just the methods she chose, but the circumstances that made such methods seem necessary, and the systems that continue to create similar pressures in different forms. The chimney that stands alone in that Louisiana field marks more than the ruins of a plantation house. It serves as a monument to the night when fire became justice, when a kitchen servant became an agent of historical change, and when the comfortable assumptions of an entire social system discovered that they could burn as easily as silk curtains in the hands of someone who had finally chosen dignity over survival. Some flames once lit can never be extinguished completely. They live on in memory, in legend, and in the understanding that resistance remains possible even under the most oppressive circumstances. The fire girl may be gone, but the fire itself burns eternal, waiting for the next moment when justice requires someone brave enough to strike the match. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.